Welcome back to Rev'd Up for Sunday, everyone. We're the clergy of St. Mark's Episcopal Church in New Canaan, Connecticut. I'm Elizabeth Garnsey.
And I'm Peter Walsh.
And I'm John Kennedy.
We have arrived at Mark 8:27 to 38, and this is the midway point in Mark's story. It's the gospel for September 15th, this coming Sunday. And let's hear the text. Jesus went on with his disciples to the villages of Caesarea Philippi, and on the way he asked his disciples, "Who do people say that I am?" And they answered him, "John the Baptist, and others Elijah, and still others one of the prophets." Jesus asked them, "But who do you say that I am?" Peter answered him, "You are the Messiah." And he sternly ordered them not to tell anyone about him. Then he began to teach them that the Son of Man must undergo great suffering and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the scribes, and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. He said this all quite openly. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But turning and looking at his disciples, he rebuked Peter and said, "Get behind me, Satan, for you are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things." He called the crowd with his disciples and said to them, "If any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake and for the sake of the gospel will save it. For what will it profit them to gain the whole world and forfeit their life? Indeed, what can they give in return for their life? For those who are ashamed of me and of my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, of them the Son of Man will also be ashamed when he comes in the glory of his Father with the holy angels." The gospel of the Lord. Well, so as I said, this is the midway point in Mark's story. And at the part one, Mark 1, it heralds the way. We have John the Baptist right away. And now we get to this point where Jesus is on the way and on the way to the cross, really, after this whole long introduction of revelations of who Jesus is and being only recognized by the kind of outsider, demons, spirits. And we've got his sort of spiritually deaf and blind disciples and challengers. So he's doubling down on his call to discipleship, and he's, Peter's confession, that we call it, his confession about who Jesus is. He's correct to say Jesus is the Messiah, but clearly still incorrect on what that means to Jesus. So I don't know, where do you want to start?
Well, I think one of the places to begin is just to follow on the last thing you just said, which is Peter gets it half right, and that the context for this is the healing of the blind man in Bethsaida. And just I'll review that for folks because it is is one of the brackets for the whole passages, the passages we're about to get for the next few chapters, which is they come to Bethsaida and there's a blind man who's calling out, and you may remember the story where Jesus, it says here, he took the blind man by the hand and led him outside in the village. And when he had spit on the man's eyes and put his hands on him, Jesus asked, "Do you see anything?" He looked up and said, "I see people. They look like trees walking." And once more Jesus put his hands on the man's eyes. Then his eyes were opened, his sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly. And that it takes 2 tries to get it right, which it did with the healing, is what we're going to see as we go through with Peter. It took Peter 2 tries, took Jesus 2 tries to get him right. So you get half right with the confession and then thoroughly wrong with the denial about suffering.
That's great. I love that.
Yeah, very interesting. I hadn't made that connection. Elizabeth, as you said, this is the sort of the hinge point of this gospel. This is sort of where part 2 begins. And it begins with yes, this confession of Peter, and then immediately followed by the first of 3 predictions of Jesus's passion. And so this is the first time that Jesus is talking about this, and the whole tone of the gospel changes. Peter, you talked about the healing of the blind man, and now from this point forward, healings will become much less common in Mark's gospel. It's almost as if Jesus is at a point in his ministry where he sees that these acts of power, as Mark calls them, or miracles, aren't going to lead his disciples to understand who he is. That as incredible as his healings, his supernatural feats seem to be, and indeed are, in a way, the more difficult thing is enlightening the sort of the spiritually blind, healing the physically blind and the deaf and so on. Like, Jesus knows how to do that. But when it comes to actually opening the eyes of the hearts of his disciples, it's another matter. It's a more challenging matter, and we see that they don't really understand. And indeed, I would say most Christians don't really understand this.
I think that in Mark, the healings of deaf and blind, which there are two more at least in Mark 9 and Mark 10, where he casts out a deaf and dumb spirit, and then he heals a blind man who follows him. After the blind man's story that you just told, I feel like these are maybe signals that there's still hope for the deaf and blind would-be disciples, and meaning hope for us too. If Jesus can heal the deaf and blind, then he can open up our hearts and our ears and eyes. So in a way, it's more challenging maybe for us to be healed in that way, but I think that Mark's offering these stories as like signposts that, there's still hope, there's still the second chance and the second try.
Oh, that's interesting, yeah.
And we especially get it at the Passion, where Peter, kind of does everything Jesus is predicting here, that he'll deny Jesus to save his own life, and and yet he still gets another chance with Jesus at the end.
Yeah, I mean, in those three Passion predictions, those stories that are coming, they all are followed by a misunderstanding and then a teaching. I mean, over and over, Jesus is in Mark's Gospel is referred to as the teacher, and we actually don't get too much teaching, but the teaching we get is really mostly cruciform teaching. It's teaching about the way of the cross. Which is what if we're at the fulcrum here and the second half has begun, it's the story of the cross. Jesus is going to the cross and the teachings about the cross. And let's just face it, even for all of us, it's super easy to see trees walking, and a lot of people have trees walking kinds of faith, where they can get kind of half of Jesus, but the second half of Jesus is really kind of tough. And it's even tough for us to try to sort out what is the way of the cross mean for us. And as you know, we get in here the paradoxical statement, for those who seek to save their life will lose it, those who lose it will save it, which is a super cool wisdom teaching. It probably could go into any tradition, but here we get tossed in for my sake and for the sake of the gospel, so that this suffering as a way of our suffering as a way of participating in the suffering, Jesus's redemptive suffering. And that whole suffering piece is that's a significant piece of this thing.
It most definitely is. I mean, Jesus talks here about the necessity of anybody who would be his disciple denying themselves, and self-denial is a huge theme in Christian spiritual and mystical literature traditions. It seems that any sound, credible teacher of the way of the mystic way, the way of spiritual transformation, that this self-denial piece is essential. It can't be avoided, and the stakes are given to us here by Jesus. If we refuse that, or if we try to cop out or dodge it or water it down or whatever, take some sort of shortcut, if we cling to our lives, our sense of who we are, our sense of what life is, we will miss out on exactly what Jesus has to offer. So, massively challenging, and I would say perhaps more challenging now than it ever has been, because everybody, thanks to having a computer in their pocket with a camera linked to social media apps, everybody more or less seems to think that they're the star of their own movie, more than ever before, with selfies and videos, of people sounding off on various things and sharing everything that's going on in their life. I'm not saying that's all bad, but I would say that to be caught up in that swirl makes it very difficult to follow Jesus here.
Would it doesn't mean to deny oneself is to like deny your true nature, deny your own story or things like that, deny your own pain. And, all these things have been kind of the puritanical way of personal and spiritualized asceticism or whatever. But to deny yourself as the center of the universe, I think that's what Jesus is trying to get his followers to do, is to like put yourself in the shoes of the suffering and put yourself in the shoes of the oppressed and get on board with correcting these systems of injustice and, rebuilding a world where, everyone has a place at the table and everyone is included and everyone is safe. And, it's, as you said, like the misunderstanding about Jesus' suffering is like the key to this passage, that Peter is still stuck on what Messiah means, that, the Messiah in the tradition was supposed to be the big hero that came to restore political fortune to Israel. But here Jesus is saying that I will suffer, I have to suffer, and it's not going to look like what you think. And to follow me into that is to do what I'm going to do, which is like take a great risk to speak the truth to Pilate, speak the truth to the authorities, and I'll be killed for it. So I think that to deny oneself, is to take yourself out of the center and get behind Jesus in this way that's going to have a whole different light on the world and what we're supposed to be doing as disciples.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the gospel here, I mean, it's a stark gospel, this passage, and this is the heart of the teaching.
It's heavy.
And it's stark. I mean, the word that is used for deny, and I'm sorry I don't have it exactly, but the word that's used for deny is much stronger than the English word for deny. It has to do with setting aside the fullness of something like boom, I set in complete setting aside, as you were each of you were talking about, the neediness, to set that aside. But it's a legal term, which is I'm done with. I renounce this. It might even be stronger. That this is a renunciation, and this is like the baptismal covenant where there were 3 renunciations and the 3 affirmations. That's a little bit of what's being acted out here. This denial is a renunciation of a whole way of life and an affirmation to follow a whole way of life. And Jesus again is Mark uses such a paucity of words here. There's so few words, and it adds to the starkness of it, and the gospel is based on the imitation of Christ, which is as he was, so are you, and as he was crucified, so are you crucified. I mean, it's that stark, bang. And then how it is that we apply that to our lives, which John, you and Elizabeth were both speaking about. How do we apply that to our lives? But it's a stark teaching. It's both great news and hard news, all one sentence apart.
Yeah.
I read the word deny as like let go of your self-preservation.
Oh, interesting.
If we're thinking of it as a legal, or in the court of law where Jesus goes before Pilate and stands trial, he doesn't do anything to defend himself or to preserve himself or save his own life. And I feel like in that sense, if that's what we're called to do, he never wavered from what he was supposed to do. Yeah.
Indeed, it is so stark. My studying of this turned up that the sense of deny oneself here is everything that you've both said, and also to disown oneself. Yeah. And back to what self is it that we are denying or disowning, etc. Elizabeth, I think you really said something so important, that Jesus is not talking about denying our true selves. What I think Jesus is talking about denying here, to use parlance, it's certainly not biblical parlance, but applicable, I think, nonetheless, is to disown the ego, or at least come into a radically different relationship to the ego. Most people, certainly in our culture, go about their lives feeling like they are located somewhere behind their eyes and between their ears, almost as if, for anybody who's seen the movie Men in Black, where the alien who appears just to be a regular person is opened up and there's like a little man that controls. That's how we're conditioned to feel we are. We're conditioned to identify with this little point of awareness where all of our memories and sensations and everything sort of comes together when we sort of our consciousness comes online. We identify with this little really kind of point of nothingness if you really examine it. Let's say in meditation, but that's another conversation. And we get so wound up identifying with what Thomas Merton called our false self, who we think we are, and its appetites and its anxieties and so on, that clinging to this sense of self is spiritual death. And this is what it means to lose your life by holding on to it. And paradoxically, when we realize that, that sense of self that I've been talking about has its place in who we are, but it's not the fullness of who we are. It's not the depths of who we are. It's not our eternal self. It's not our true self, etc. And we can actually experience and have some sort of contact with who we really are. Then we are in the divine life. We're in the divine flow. In Christian terms, right? This is sort of entering into the Trinitarian flow of being joined alongside Jesus as the Son of God into the flow between the Father and the Spirit and so on. But in other traditions, in Zen Buddhism, for instance, coming to this sort of awareness of oneself simply as present, as alive, as like here and now, and not with all this baggage of our story and all that stuff, that awareness is accompanied by like profound joy. That joy just sort of underlies that sort of experience and that sort of sense of who one is. So that's a big part of how I understand it. And then that sort of mystical, if you can put it that way, I think you can, sensibility, I think flows very naturally into the moral concerns that you're talking about, because with that comes a sort of universal solidarity, right? That the good of everybody else is my own good as well, because there isn't really this neat separation between you and me and everybody else, that we're all sort of part of one world together. Obviously it was a lot to unpack there, but that's a big part of how I take Jesus' teaching here.
That's interesting, because in the, you're taking a look, and there is, as you said, John, we could do a whole podcast on the different religious views on the question of that interior zone that you're describing, and emptiness and all that. I just also want to bring it back to Jesus, and Jesus is going to die, and his followers are going to die. And last week I proclaimed that I was really more interested in Jesus than the Markan people, and now this week I'm more interested in the Markan people. So it just goes to show you can't believe a thing I say. But anyway, so the area that I got lost in here, in my preparations for here, was not just in the zone that you've been talking about here, but that. So Jesus is crucified, and then this brings us to Rome, because we're talking about Rome as the location of Peter's gospel. And I was coming back to my own trips to Rome and had forgotten a lot of things, like tradition has it that St. Paul was beheaded in Rome. Those who went on the St. Francis trip to Rome with us, we went down to a hole in the ground, which is now way 30, 40 feet below the ground, where they believe that's where Paul spent his final days before he's beheaded. There's a prison where they say that is venerated, where Paul spent his final days. And then along the Appian Way, there's a place where during the Neronian persecutions, Peter was fleeing the city, and he bumped into the resurrected Christ, and you get Quo Vadis, where are you going? And Jesus says, I'm going back to be crucified. And Peter turns around, and we have Peter crucified in Rome, upside down, because he didn't want to be crucified as his Lord. And so we have the Neronian persecutions that went on from 64 after the fire, where 10 out of the 14 districts were burned. That kind of popped up for 31 years. And then at the same time, we have, this is the so-called First Jewish War from 66 to 70, and the wiping out of the temple. I mean, there's a lot of people dying
Yeah.
I mean, they're dead. They're dead. They're not. This is a whole other thing happening here,
Right.
and that's when you talk about the starkness of this. This is,
Yeah.
and even in today, look at that. Eliza Griswold wrote a book about the parallel in which Christians are dying for their saying, "I'm going to cling to Christ," and they're dying for this. So around the world, we have anywhere from around 5,000 to more than 5,000 people dying a year for their saying, Jesus saying, "Follow me," and they're doing that. So it's all of these things all wrapped together.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, you paint a very good, clear backdrop for the context in which Mark is written, and I think that when Jesus says, "Take up your cross," he's describing that scene, and he's describing the scene where you'll die for justice rather than kill for justice. And Jesus did that. And I think the Jewish insurrection, maybe is following more the messianic tradition of taking back their place by force.
Yeah.
And that's what the disciples are hoping for. They want Jesus to be that kind of a Messiah and to step into the fray and do something. And I think that that's when Peter says, "You are the Messiah," that's what he has in mind. Mm-hmm. And when Jesus says, "Take up your cross," he's looking around at all these people that are just, they're dying and they're not defending themselves, or, they're not, that's what Jesus's path is going to lead him into.
Yeah, I mean,
and he's not going to do it by force.
With this whole question of Messiah, I mean, I think that as Christians, and we're professional Christians, what a weird thing that is to say, we receive the New Testament's look at this. What is a Messiah? What is the expectation? Luke says a bunch of times, as it is written, but where is it written? I mean, there's really only one really clear messianic passage, super crystal clear. Well, it's not even super crystal clear in Daniel, and this is where you get all this Son of Man language. And the Son of Man language would bring us to both suffering and glory, because that's what happens in Daniel. And there is this political Messiah in Daniel, but in some of these others, it's not so. It's even less clear. And then in the Christian tradition, with suffering servant and all this, kind of writes back into the drama. Oh, it must mean this, and so all that stuff we just take because our tradition has interpreted it as such. But I think in the moment, pretty hard to figure out. Yeah,
most definitely is. This is not a Messiah that anybody was expecting. And it's still kind of shocking to me that Jesus came along and had this vision for who the Messiah was, and then said, "That's me. I'm going to do it."
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, incredible. And I think we're still invited to figure it out. And I think that we don't, in a way, it's not so complicated. We're just unwilling to really put ourselves out there and try it. If we're going to take the difficult political risks and choices to confront systems that oppress and deny the poor and, constantly defend the wealthy over against the poor. I mean, Jesus wasn't really over against anyone. He was here for the whole world and here for the rich and the poor. But the systems were always oppressing the poor. And I feel like it's not so hard in our society to see the places where we could join him in that. And it's risky because you get killed for it, or you get canceled, or, drowned out. And I think what you're talking about in the mystical tradition I loved your description of the Men in Black image of, the little man controlling us, and that's what we think we are. In the mystical tradition, the goal is to come to see that there is no separation between any of us. And Jesus was so clearly comfortable with that. He just relaxed his life into that reality, and he was not concerned that he was going to be killed for his clarity, that all are connected, and that, there's the violence itself that we practice is the enemy. And he wasn't out to get the enemies or take one side over against another. But, we're constantly making these divisions that God just doesn't recognize. And so I think that that's where it's not so complicated. It just takes a humongous amount of taking ourselves out of the center and joining ourselves with that greater whole that Jesus showed us and represents.
Okay, and yes, and an incredible vision of this. I guess what I was talking about here with reference to complicated has to do with the language that Jesus is using, and it's theological language. The Son of Man is a theological idea, and Jesus is interpreting the Hebrew Scriptures through a particular lens that, you know, and so when he says Son of Man, he doesn't say, I am going to do this. He says, the Son of Man. So he's now identifying with Son of Man, which is echoing into a scripture that has a view of things. And then he moves it again. And, you know, he's very particular about what the Son of Man must. And he gives very, very particular of what the must be. And the way the must is it's delivered that is a theological idea that God has determined that this is how salvation is to come, through the Son of Man who has to undergo these things, and the result is this salvation, this new way of being, this new kingdom. But that Peter's misunderstanding, Peter's gets it half right, you are Messiah, but he gets all the rest of that stuff wrong. I mean, even the 3 days, where does it actually say 3 days in the scriptures? Well, it says it in like the book of Hosea, and that's just the people of Israel, and it's a proverbial 3 days. It's not 3 days. And so when Jesus talks, he's constantly interpreting his tradition to tell people this is God's desire, the Father's desire, that this might happen, even though we hardly ever hear about the Father in Mark's gospel. And that's what I was saying was complicated, and not to say that, it doesn't change anything that you've said, but in the text, there's a lot of things happening that are like, wow.
I'm not sure if you meant it this way, but I don't think that it's God's desire that Jesus suffer. I think it's Jesus can't do anything but, you know, face the suffering that he's going to face because this is the life he's living. And I don't think God, you know, wants Jesus to suffer. And in other words, like the must undergo suffering is, how could I not? You know, I have to do what I'm doing and I will suffer for it. And Jesus, you know, is God going in that way?
I don't know. Now we're beyond my pay grade, my knowledge level. My understanding is that then he began to teach. So in other words, he's going to teach them all along. Now that they know who he is, he's now going to teach them what it means that the Son of Man must undergo great suffering and be rejected by the elders and the chief priests, and who get this litany of all the things that happen. My understanding, and maybe I'm completely wrong, is the mustness of it does come from the divine, not from his choice. But again, I'm just a priest. I'm not a theologian, so I don't know the answer to that.
I just don't feel like God is violent, so I can't imagine God.
I don't either. I have the brutalist time. Speaking brutal, God is love is I think the most important passage, most important single sentence in the New Testament.
I might venture to say that both of you are right.
That's so pragmatic.
It's the divine plan precisely because, you know, God and God's perfect wisdom and knowledge of humanity, human affairs, the human heart, knows that the way to salvation has to be the way of the cross. And so in recognition of what the human situation is, God wills that Jesus go this way.
Yeah. Interesting. I know. I like your face because I'm in that place too. I'm not claiming knowledge here. I just want to say that. I'm just claiming a study. And when I was preparing for this, you know what I wrote on my paper here? Verses 34 to 38, the way of cross to be the way of life. So, which is in the marriage rite.
I know,
and which is I've done so
amazing.
many weddings lately. Remember we were talking about that before we started the pod, because it has in one of the prayers before the nuptial blessing. Yeah. We give thanks for for making the way of the cross to be the way of life. And so is this to say this self-denial thing that we were talking about earlier, and you were bearing witness to, for people who do the way of the cross, the way of denial, they discover on the other end phenomenal life.
Yeah.
But now you're coming with a theological position that I particularly like. And I'm defending a theological position that I don't even like, but I think might
Well,
actually
it's
be
out
in
there.
the text.
I mean,
right?
it's the
I don't
strongest
know.
one out there is
Yeah, it
this
might be in the
idea that it's
text.
divine appointment to go and suffer. I mean, I know we have to wrap up this podcast, and I do get to have a sermon about it, so maybe that'll lead me somewhere. But, I think the self-denial has been so misconstrued over time that it's been a cause for great suffering and enslavement and all of these things. So it's a lot. We just started the real discussion, I think, here, but maybe that'll spark some discussion among our congregation
on the pod
and
they can have at it.
But thanks this is a great conversation, and thanks for following with us, everyone, and we'll see you in church on Sunday. Continue the conversation. See you soon.